This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 556 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Each week, FanDuel is offering fans the chance to win prizes by participating in daily fantasy football. The prize pool for this week's Sunday Million is a whopping $2.5 million. First place takes home $1 million. All you have to do is head over to FanDuel today and click on the NFL Sunday Million contest. Draft your lineup of players, sit back, and enjoy some NFL football. Go to FanDuel.com today to participate in the NFL Sunday Million. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. We've got some transactions to talk about. Let's get to it. Buy Calvin Ridley. We shouldn't be viewing Calvin Ridley the same way that we viewed him entering the season. Through 4 games, Ridley has yet to finish as a top 15 wide receiver in a single week. He's averaging fewer than 15 PPR points per game. He hasn't given us his vintage blow-up contest. And the Atlanta offense hasn't been very good either. They've been below average in both offensive touchdowns scored and yards per drive. But here's the good news, and here's why I'm buying Calvin Ridley after week 4. His peripheral numbers are still pretty good. He's not seeing work down the field like he did a year ago, but he's got 10 targets so far this season of 15-plus air yards. The league leader is at 13. He's also a fringe top 25 player in total air yards. And he's comfortably ranking in the top 10 in total targets. The volume is still there. Ridley has a near 27% target share this season. And he's had back-to-back games seeing over 30% of the Falcons' targets. He just hasn't found the end zone. That's what this comes down to. Ridley ranks as a lower-end wide receiver 2 in PPR formats right now, even though he's only scored once. We can't expect this pace to continue. Not only has Ridley been able to find the end zone consistently in the past, but he's top 10 in the league right now, both in targets within the opponent's 20-yard line and within the opponent's 10-yard line. Things should get better for Calvin Ridley. Sell Cordarrelle Patterson. So I talk about this basically every single week, but one of the tougher things about giving buy and sell recommendations is that they're not just based entirely on the player himself and how we view that player moving forward. We're also working with the market. If a player is doing things at an unsustainable rate, selling that player only makes sense if your league mates view that production as sustainable. So if someone in your league thinks that Cordarrelle Patterson can keep this up, then you should be willing to trade Patterson away. And look, I love the story of Patterson this year. It's so much fun. He's 30 years old and he's mostly played wide receiver and special teams throughout his NFL career. His single season high in rush attempts came last year. He ran the ball a grand total of 64 times. But through Sunday night's game, there's only one running back in the NFL with more fantasy points than Cordarrelle Patterson, and that's Derrick Henry. Now, Patterson's peripherals aren't terrible, but they're definitely not that good. Let's not fool ourselves. On the season, he has a pretty good target share of 13.5%. But that's something that 10 other running backs have. And he's seen just 31% of Atlanta's running back rushes. That running back rush share has been seen by over 40 running backs. And he's only played 34.4% of Atlanta's snaps. That's a lower snap share than Mark Ingram and Kenneth Gainwell. Now, the hope is that Patterson sees more snaps moving forward. And maybe that happens. That should happen. But he's scoring the most fantasy points per snap played this year by a healthy margin, by a lot. And it's mostly because he's scoring touchdowns at a rate that he's likely not going to continue. He has 4 receiving touchdowns on 22 targets. He's scoring through the air on every 5.5 targets. Among every single running back season over the last decade where the running back saw 20 or more targets, only Kareem Hunt's 2018 season had a lower targets per touchdown rate. He had 7 touchdowns that year through the air on 35 targets. Of all the wide receivers with 20 or more targets, it's happened twice. And the thing is, this is happening for Patterson in an offense that's been below average. Patterson now has half of Atlanta's receiving touchdowns. Now, I think Patterson is going to be relevant in fantasy football moving forward. This isn't that fluky. I mean, it's fluky, but it's not that fluky. Let's just be realistic about what's to come. He's not going to maintain this pace. And if you can sell Cordarrelle Patterson here as the RB2, go ahead and do it. Add Trey Lance. So Jimmy Garoppolo, he has a calf injury. He could miss Sunday's game. That means that it's Trey Lance's team. He's the starter. Lance played one half of football in week 4. In that half, he showed off his fantasy upside. He was 9 of 18 for 157 yards and a pair of touchdowns. But most importantly, he ran the ball 7 times for 41 yards. He gave us over 20 standard fantasy points in one half of a game. The 49ers get the Cardinals upcoming. That's a good offense. They're going to have to keep pace with that offense. Trey Lance is a must-add this week. Add Damian Williams. So another injury that happened this week was to David Montgomery. At the time of this recording, I don't know exactly how long he's going to be out, but he's going to be out more than likely. Fortunately, it doesn't sound like it's an ACL injury though. But with David Montgomery sidelined, we're going to see more Damian Williams. I think that Williams could be a reasonable RB2 or flex option without Montgomery. We know that he's a good pass catcher. We know that he's serviceable on the ground. He did have a thigh injury in that game on Sunday, but it sounds like he's going to be okay. So add Damian Williams, and if you're in a deep league, you could look at Khalil Herbert too, because he might get a little bit more run now. Buy Darrell Henderson. I think Darrell Henderson might be my favorite buy of the week. He's been low-key borderline elite this year, but I feel like the rest of the fantasy football world doesn't recognize this. He's now played in 3 games this year. He's finished 2 of them. In the 2 that he's finished, he's averaged a running back rush share per game of 88.2% and a target share per game of 9.2%. But over his last 2 games in general, so one of those games he left early, Henderson has target shares of 17.2% and 14.6%. Those numbers are very good. And those numbers are coming within a good offense. The Rams through 4 games have been strong. They've scored about 3 more offensive touchdowns than the league average. And Henderson, with 1 game missed, has as many goal line rushes as Aaron Jones and Nick Chubb. He's tied for 4th in the NFL in goal line rushing touchdowns. So as long as Darrell Henderson's healthy, those opportunities are going to continue to be there. And here's the thing, guys. Here's the kicker. LA's got a very attractive schedule. Over their next 11 matchups, only 3 of them are below average when looking at my adjusted fantasy points allowed method. And through the end of the fantasy football season, only Houston and Jacksonville have better running back schedules. Now that can change with more data, and it will change with more data, but it's still something. It's still favorable for Darrell Henderson. This is the week to buy him. Add AJ Green. Even if you thought that AJ Green was dust last season, you can't deny what he's doing in Arizona right now. In one of the best offenses in football, he's commanded an 18.6% target share. He's now finished in the top 40 in weekly scoring at the wide receiver position in 3 consecutive weeks. And he's had back-to-back wide receiver 2 performances. This isn't some fluke. He's comfortably played the second most snaps at wide receiver for the Cardinals. He should be rostered in way more than the 24% of Yahoo leagues that he's rostered in. Sell Dallas Goedert. So after 4 games, Dallas Goedert is the 8th best tight end in fantasy football. That's not saying much, but he's there. And I know that finding a reliable tight end is not easy. But Goddard's not doing anything special to make me think that he's going to be elite this year. His target share is still under 12%. He's running a similar number of routes as Zach Ertz is. And Ertz actually has a higher target share this season. He just has found the end zone once to Goddard's 2 touchdowns. So after Goddard's week 4 performance, I think it's a good sell high moment. Add Kadarius Toney. Now look, it was tough to buy into Kadarius Toney as this elite wide receiver prospect during draft season. He didn't have the best prospect profile. But what he did have in his favor is that he was athletic for sure, but he also had draft capital. I do think that Toney can be an effective slot weapon. And with Sterling Shepard not in the lineup for the Giants on Sunday, Toney was able to play 57.5% of his snaps from that area of the field according to Pro Football Focus. He was their slot guy for the most part. He caught 3 of 4 targets for 34 yards. Outside the slot, he had 3 more catches for 44 additional yards. And then in sum, he had a 25% target share in that game. If Sterling Shepard and Darius Slayton keep missing time with hamstring injuries, Kadarius Toney is going to be on the field. And even if they come back, Kadarius Toney could eventually just carve out a role in this offense. I thought that he looked pretty good on Sunday. Buy CeeDee Lamb. So CeeDee Lamb now has back-to-back weeks where he's finished outside the top 50 at wide receiver and PPR formats. Over 25 wide receivers currently have more fantasy points than CeeDee Lamb through 4 weeks. But it's not time to panic. Dallas hasn't faced a shootout since week 1 against Tampa Bay. And really, we shouldn't expect that moving forward. Their upcoming schedule is pretty beatable. But with that being said, Lamb has had just 1 game this season where his target share dipped below 22.7%. He's still run the most routes on the team over the last 2 weeks, even if his production isn't totally matching. And the Cowboys are tied for 3rd in the league in touchdowns. The Cowboys offense looks great. You want a part of that offense. So if the Lamb manager in your league is upset over this 2-week stretch, send them an offer. Add Dalton Schultz. So speaking of CeeDee Lamb, part of the reason why Lamb hasn't been able to see a more significant target share is because of Dalton Schultz and Dalton Schultz's usage. Over the first 2 weeks of the season, Schultz was just edging out Blake Jarwin in terms of usage. He had just 3 more routes run, and they both had the exact same number of targets. Week 3 once again saw the same number of routes run. But Schultz started to separate. He had 7 targets to Jarwin's 2. He was the top fantasy football tight end in week 3. And that continued in week 4. Now, Blake Jarwin was fine enough because he found the end zone, but Schultz saw 8 targets to Jarwin's 3. It was also the first game this season where we saw a significant difference in routes run between the 2 tight ends. Dalton Schultz had 19, Blake Jarwin 9. With his usage over the last 2 weeks, Schultz has scored almost 44 PPR points. Guys, he's a fantasy football tight end 1. Add Van Jefferson. Van Jefferson is the perfect example as to why I look at peripherals. I've featured him on this podcast this season already, and it's all because of peripherals. His production wasn't great through the first 3 weeks of the season. He was averaging 8.9 PPR points per game. But after week 3, Jefferson had more routes run than teammate Robert Woods. He was playing a lot of snaps. Even his 12.6% target share per game wasn't all that bad considering the offense that he's playing in. But week 4 was really good for Van Jefferson. He saw his target share get up to almost 15%, and he caught all 6 of his targets for 90 yards and a touchdown. He's not going to be super reliable week in and week out. He can be a flex option here or there, but he's not going to be all that reliable. But the other thing with someone like Jefferson is that if an injury occurs to someone like Robert Woods or Cooper Kupp, Jefferson gets elevated. So he's a flex option some weeks when you're in a pinch, but he also has some upside. Sell Kareem Hunt. So in games played with Nick Chubb last season, Kareem Hunt averaged a 37.6% running back rush share and a 10.3% target share per game. That resulted in 13.7 PPR points per game. This year, Hunt's running back rush share is 37%. That's right in line with last year. His target shares jumped a little bit to 13.2%. But his PPR points per game is now 16.9. That's a lot higher than last year. And naturally, this is the result of touchdowns skewing this result. Cleveland has found the end zone 11 times on offense this year. Of those 11, 9 of them have come via the ground. That gives them a pass-to-rush touchdown ratio of 0.22. No team has come close to that low of a ratio over the last 10 seasons. The league average has been 2.2, not 0.22. To put this another way, the Browns aren't going to continue scoring touchdowns on the ground at this rate. And neither is Kareem Hunt. Hunt has now converted 2 of his 3 goal line rushes into touchdowns this year. That's a 66.7% conversion rate. His career average goal line conversion rate is 50%. And last year, just for some comparison, he converted 5 of his 13 goal line rushes. Regression is inevitable. And the Cleveland schedule doesn't help things either. Over the team's next 4 games, they get 4 top half teams in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. That includes 2 top 5 units in Pittsburgh and Denver. I don't mind Kareem Hunt as a fantasy asset, but just temper your expectations. Hold Odell Beckham. So honestly, before I looked at the Browns' schedule, I thought that Odell Beckham was going to be a buy in this week's episode. And if you don't care about matchups that much, maybe you can go out and buy Beckham. Or use the schedule to your advantage when you're negotiating. Now, week 4 was really rough, but it was mostly Baker Mayfield. He didn't have a good game. According to Next Gen Stats, he had a completion percentage over expected of minus 13.5%. Beckham had 7 targets, but he only caught 2 of them for 27 yards. But here's the good news. So far, Odell Beckham has looked fine. And his target shares across his first 2 games of the season have been 31% and 22.6%. And keep in mind what I just said about Kareem Hunt. Soon enough, the Browns are going to start throwing for their touchdowns, as opposed to rushing for them. They're not going to keep up this insanely low pass to rush touchdown ratio. When that happens, the pass catchers benefit. Beckham should be fine enough through this stretch of tougher matchups. But because of those matchups, it's probably not necessary to aggressively trade for him. Add Samaje Perine. So Joe Mixon hurt his ankle at the end of Cincinnati's matchup against Jacksonville on Thursday night. He's now considered week to week. If he's unable to go in week 5, Samaje Perine is next in line. Now, Perine's been digging into Mixon's workload as a pass catcher over the last couple of weeks, but he does have some experience as a lead back. He's had 15 or more carries in a game 6 times throughout his career. So he's probably the back that you want to prioritize off the waiver wire in this Cincinnati backfield. Although you could also add Chris Evans. Evans is a bigger bodied rookie who's capable of catching passes out of the backfield as well. Add the Minnesota Vikings defense. The Vikings are 7.5-point home favorites against the Lions this week. They're a good streaming option. Detroit's allowed 2.5 sacks per game this year, and they've been a bottom half team in sack rate allowed and total sacks allowed. Minnesota, meanwhile, ranks in the top 10 in pressure rate and they're top 5 in sack rate. So go get the Vikings. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to add Jeremy McNichols. Back when Jeremy McNichols came out of the draft, I liked him. I was into him. He was my Kylan Hill in that draft class. His career hasn't gone as planned, but the Titans are utilizing him a lot this year as a pass catcher. Over his 4 games, he's seen target shares of 11.4%, 7.7%, 7.7%, and then almost 25% this past week. Now, week 4 likely had to do or partially had to do with the injuries to Julio Jones and A.J. Brown. Ryan Tannehill didn't have many places to throw to. But McNichols could have flex appeal at times in deeper PPR leagues. And he's got more upside if Derrick Henry ever does indeed break down, which clearly he's superhuman and it's probably not going to happen. But McNichols could see a big bump if that happened. So if you're in a PPR format and you want to add a guy who won't cost a whole lot, McNichols does make sense. He's got deep league flex appeal, but if something happens to Derrick Henry, there's a little bit more upside. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the Weekly 10 Trend Show.